Hi, it's Corbett Harrison, and today we're going to talk about going way beyond the simple memorization of vocabulary words, how to turn vocabulary into a high-level thinking experience in your classrooms. I'm talking about the top 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy here, and apply as the bottom of those top 3, and what you have to do when you apply knowledge is you have to explore it in a different context. Not do it the exact same way that you did it in class, but try it with a different problem in a different scenario. And to me, that's the basis of all my vocabulary when I'm getting them to think. Memorizing is very low level on Bloom's. I used to be the teacher who that's what we would do, though. We start off our teaching careers, I think, by doing bad practices that were done to us because we don't know any better yet until we get some experience. What you have here on screen, these are 10 words, random words, unrelated, from an SAT preparation list. And every Monday, I would give my students 10 words. They had 10 minutes to write them down and their definitions. Every Friday, we would take a matching quiz over them. My students admittedly would just memorize the words on Thursday before they took my test, or Friday, the period right before they took my test, and then they promptly forgot the words. It was a score for the grade book, but it was not anything meaningful. The students didn't have any ownership of those particular words. When I headed back to the classroom after 10 years of professional development, one of the books that was sent to me by an author was The Boy Who Loved Words by Ronnie Schotter. She noticed some of the things I was doing online with our other books, and she sent me this wonderful book about a person who celebrates words, to collects them when he hears a new or interesting word, puts it in his pocket, and waits for a new opportunity to arise where he can pull that word out of his pocket and use it in that situation. It kind of became the basis for what I did to make my vocabulary instruction different in my classroom. The Boy Who Loved Words is probably appropriate for 5th, 6th up if you're building a love of vocabulary with younger kids. I always suggest Max's Words or the Fancy Nancy books. They also are about young characters who just celebrate the idea of learning excellent new words that they didn't know before. I'm going to make myself The Boy Who Loved Words and talk to you about the difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary to get started. First of all, there is a Tier 1. Those are your sight words. Those are your words you don't really need to look up in the dictionary. Tier 2 vocabulary words are those quality words you would read in an article, in literature, that you would hope students would be able to use in a discussion. Good SAT kind of words. And then there are your Tier 3 vocabulary words, which I've given you a couple for math, social studies, and science. This is from an 8th grade list that I found. You have to be tricky with Tier 3 vocabulary words because a lot of them, like the word congruent there, have meanings beyond math. But I think that actually works for the advantage if you were teaching congruent in math class, to be able to explore it from the math definition, but also the other definition of congruent, and use that to help kids really understand what congruent means. Context clues. So I require my students to write their own context clues, putting new vocabulary words into different situations. A context clue is basically it's other words or phrases in a sentence or in a discussion around the vocabulary word, where if you heard the word in a sentence or in a thought, you would be able to take a good logical guess on what the word might mean. Context clues. We teach our kids to read context clues. If we took the first word from that list I just showed you, abrogate, and I gave you the definition. If I didn't give you the definition, if I just gave you this particular sentence, this sentence has a good enough context clue that you probably would be pretty close to guessing what the word means. And like I said, we teach our kids to read the words around a word to pick up context clues. What we don't do very often, and this is what I do to up my instruction, is I teach them to write their own context clues. And so I would show them a sentence like this and say, you really can't logically guess probably with 100% certainty what abrogate means because the context clues are not specific enough, and so I up the context clue in front of them. A good father or mother would never abrogate. I changed a couple words there. And then I would go even further. I actually require 2 context clues for my students. And so what I've done is I've underlined them, which is often what I ask my students to underline or highlight them. So they show me, here are the context clues I left for someone who's going to read what I wrote so they could make a good guess about this word, whose meaning I know and who I'm trying to share with you. 10 words. That used to be the way I did it. You really can't make them pocket words like the main character in The Boy Who Loved Words does, just by memorizing them. My kids can quote the research that I share with them all the time. You got to have 8 to 10 meaningful experiences with any word before you can call it one of your pocket words. Meaningful is probably not memorizing it and matching it on a quiz. Meaningful is thinking of it in a different context. 8 to 10 experiences before a word becomes one of your own. And I think that creating those context clues is a very high level experience for all learning styles, assuming you teach it well. And so so creating those context clues is one meaningful experience, and then in my vocabulary instruction days, they go and they teach their words to each other, and that becomes another meaningful experience. We play games with words rather than just memorizing the first word on that list I showed you, blasphemy. Sometimes we played what's called the EGOT game. My kids came up with the name for EGOT game, but a lot of tier 2 and tier 3 words are going to be nouns, verbs, adjectives, or adverbs, and a lot of words like blasphemy actually have a form for all 4 of those parts of speech, and it's fun, I think, to teach students to look for those. You can learn 4 vocabulary words for the price of 1. My kids call this the EGOT game. An EGOT is an acronym from show business where a person who gets the 4 major awards, there they are, Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, Tony, they have an EGOT. There's only been like 13 or 14 people in history who've ever done that. You can look them up to see who they are anywhere, but EGOT is what it's called. My students say, okay, if a word has all 4 forms, then it wins an EGOT. And so they kind of came up with that name after we were doing a study on acronyms. I love it when my kids name my activities. This is one of their activities that they named for me. The idea of the EGOT is once you discover it, then you create a ridiculous sentence where you use all 4 forms, and you also insert context clues. You can't just slam them all in a really short sentence. The blasphemous, blaspheme blasphemously. You can't just do that because there's not a context clue in there. And so here what you're seeing is me using all 4 words, and I've underlined my context clues. My students love to write these sentences because they're silly. They then have, if they have a word that someone else doesn't have that they're sharing it with, the other person gets to take a wild guess on what the word means. The EGOTs are a good activity. It goes way deeper than just memorizing the definition of blasphemy. Again, EGOTs. The second word on that list I've been showing is the word credible. Question, is that an EGOT? Take a moment to think about it. And the thing about credible is, like many words, it's actually what we call a trigot. It's only got 3 of the legs. There is no verb for the adjective credible. The joke in my class is we say, well, I tried, but I only got 3. But we call those trigots. But the fact that those students are looking for those, that's teaching them not only a little bit about grammar, but I would say you're learning 4 vocabulary words for the price of 1 if you ever discover an EGOT. So another activity that I do if I give words like these is I ask them to write a vocabulary haiku, better than just memorizing. A haiku is a 5 syllable short poem. It's supposed to be about nature, and so if I required students to take a word and put it in a natural context, they're having to think of a new context to use that word, and that is higher level thinking. Here are some, the book that I use to teach this is If Not for the Cat by Jack Perletsky. Here's the title haiku from that particular book. I love his haikus because they are from the point of view of animals, that the kids can guess what they are if you don't show them the pictures, but they also all have at least 1 good vocabulary word in them, which is what I'm asking students to do. And so, if not for the cat, here's a great one. Raucously we caw, your straw men do not fool us, we burgle your corn. Obviously that's a crow, but there's 2 great vocabulary words in there. Here's what the students do. Let's say we took enigma, the 4th word down from that list, and we said, how could I use this in a natural context? Here's one that I wrote about the nautilus shell. It is 575. You can check my math if you want to pause. Here's me putting harbinger in a vocabulary haiku. Here's labyrinthine. What I'm doing here is I'm making myself think about a totally different way to use the word and forcing it into a small piece of writing. Haikus are a great way to get kids to think about vocabulary differently. You do have to teach the process. Haikus are really fast to write, but they can be improved upon. I always show the students one of my rough draft haikus. Here's one for tumultuous, and then I show them my final draft, which I kind of tweaked a little bit to make it more about mythology. But the students see, oh yeah, you can even improve on 17 syllables. So it's not just as fast as you can write a haiku. It's write one that's good and then improve upon it so it's even better. My students, of course, have to see criteria for all of my activities. I have 4 points of criteria they're trying to meet. And then I keep student samples like crazy. I take pictures of them with my camera phone. Here's an 8th grader on the left and a 6th grader's on the right. If you don't have samples, you can always show your own. But once you start doing this, start saving your samples, because students love to analyze student samples against the criteria. Right? And so, when I teach a vocabulary activity, I just want to talk about my 4 main points. I always have to share at least a model and have criteria. You need to build that. First 2 attempts that my students do, I make them do it with partners for the safety of the group. It's kind of hard for a student who's not creative to come up with a haiku and then force it into that format. But in pairs or small groups, they can usually do it and help each other navigate the process. I model revision. I don't want them to give me just a rough draft. I want them to make it good. And then their 3rd try is when we start trying them on our own. But this is how my students build vocabulary. Another activity I love to do is personify a vocabulary word. This is inspired by a book called Miscellaneous, where the young girl mishears the word, thinks they're saying miscellaneous, and so then she comes dressed to school as miscellaneous, and her costume represents what miscellaneous means. It's a fun idea. Here's my criteria for my students. You can pause and read those carefully. Here's a student sample about Miss Incredulous. My students love to put the word Mr. or Miss or doctor or baby in front of a word, and suddenly they personify it so that the personality, the clothing, the job description that they have somehow fits what the word means. I model. Defenestrate is one of my favorite words in English. It means to throw someone or something out the window, and so here's my rough draft of someone named Mr. Defenestrate. Here's my improved draft. You got to model that if you want revision to happen. Here's some student samples. You can pause and take a look at them to see what students can do. When they're owning these vocabulary words, we do fewer words than 10 each week, but they get words, they learn them at a deeper level. And to me, that's a quality classroom. Less is more, as long as what you're doing is you're going deeper with that. And so the idea of personification, yet another of my activities. Think about if there was Claude Plaudit from this list, how would you personify him? If there was Marty Tardy, how would you personify that particular person? That's what the students are challenged with. For this last bit, I want you to think about reprehensible, the word, which is an adjective to describe behavior that is shameful or bad. And I'm going to show you some of the activities my students have made very quickly. They like word art, where they visually represent the word, and then because I require writing, I make them explain their representations. Here's an example for exacerbate. If you were to make word art for the word reprehensible, what would it look like? My students came up with this one too, superhero, supervillain. It's kind of personification meets antonyms and synonyms. The word becomes either the superhero or the supervillain, and then you create the other half and describe. And so here's an example for the word oblique. What would you do? Would reprehensible be the superhero or the supervillain? My students came up with this idea. I never say this word right. I think it's legerdemain, but create a fake phone app that would be named your vocabulary word. You have to draw a little icon picture, you have to do the description of what the app does, and then you have to have one review. My kids came up with this. I think it's brilliant. And then my dark thinking kids came up with the idea of the fake horror movie poster. The word has to be in the title or in the tagline. This is the organ procurer, and the tagline is just what's on the inside that counts. But it's a great way for kids to think about words in those different contexts. I've just showed you six of my activities. I actually have 16 on my vocabulary page at my website. If you Google, look above, Corbett Harrison vocabulary, you'll see those. The fun thing that I get my students to is they start doing it with Tier 3 vocabulary words too. And so thanks for listening today. I'm out of